everybody. This episode of the podcast is being sponsored by my friends over at Real Mushrooms, my friend Jeff Chilton and his son Sky. I interviewed Jeff on one of the earlier episodes of this podcast. Really happy that they're sponsoring this podcast. They sell medicinal mushrooms, things like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. I think more and more people are becoming familiar with the truly amazing benefits of medicinal mushrooms on our physical, our mental, even our spiritual well-being. They're an amazing company. They're one of the few, if any, companies that's not only 100% organic, but 100% mushrooms, and that's really rare. A lot of companies have fillers or additives, or also important, it's not the mycelium that's grown on grain and mixed together, it's the actual mushroom, and that's a really rare thing. It's a really pure product. It's the only product, the medicinal mushroom product that I take. Super happy with them, super happy that they're sponsoring this podcast. If you'd like more information about them, you can check out their website at realmushrooms.com/universe to also receive 25% off of your first order. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Simon Borg-Olivier. Simon is a really interesting guy. He was recommended to me by a listener of this show. Thank you to you for recommending him. He is a yoga teacher, although he, I think very wisely, doesn't confine himself necessarily to just that word or that practice. But we did speak very deeply about yoga, about the roots of it, the history, his journey in life. He's been doing this practice for a long time now. He had some amazing teachers, really the foundational teachers of in the West, what we consider yoga: Pattabhi Jois, Iyengar, Desikachar. He's had a really fascinating life, really fascinating journey. He spent a lot of time in India, a lot of time in China, and we spoke all about that and just yoga as a whole, and also what it means simply beyond the mat, but the more meditative, the lifestyle aspect of it, and other practices that he's done too, things like Qigong, and I think just looking at these things from a much deeper space and a much more holistic way. Very good storyteller, very enjoyable to interview. I think we went over 2 hours. I think we easily could have done another 2. So hopefully we'll have him back on for round 2. But I think and trust you all will gain a lot from his wisdom. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, Patreon is a really big help. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Also, those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, some different bonus materials, Q&As. As always, thank you very much to the people supporting that way. I really like that website because it's based off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, it's a beautiful way to give back. And then finally, if you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Murav Artsy, we have our 2026 calendar online. So if you're interested in working with plants and plants as medicine on a deeper level, it's a really beautiful opportunity. We'll be in Peru, we'll be in Europe and Ireland, working some remotely. We'll probably have some more dates up soon too. But you can check out that on my website at nicotianarustica.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And then finally, if you'd like to help with the algorithms, that's always really helpful in getting the show out to a bigger audience. So sharing with friends, recommending it, and specifically with the algorithms, if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video. And if you're listening to this on the big platforms, Spotify and Apple Podcast, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So I think that's it for the intro. I hope this finds you all well, and I hope you enjoy this very interesting and beautiful conversation with Simon.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, great. Well, Simon, thank you so much for joining. We were chatting a little bit before we started, and it sounds like a listener of yours, someone who's been involved in your online work, and a listener of my podcast, recommended you to me. And I had a look, and I think you're doing really amazing work. We were chatting a little before we started, but yoga, qigong, tai chi, all of these things, Eastern systems of medicine, were always a really big part of the formation, I think, of who I am and my work. So I thought you'd be a really good guest. I imagine some of the audience has probably heard of you, and I would imagine some people haven't. I know it's a big question, but maybe to start, you can just speak a little bit about yourself, about who you are, your journey, what you do, and just kind of your journey in life that got you to where you are now.
Okay, it's very nice to be here. Lovely to meet you. I was born in Malta 65 years ago. My father was a free diver in the army, and he was my introduction to working with the body. He taught me how to hold my breath. So from the age of 6, I was just realizing that the most important thing about breathing is to learn how not to do it, and to breathe as little as possible while doing as much as possible. And that was wonderful. And right after that, about 2 years later, we migrated to Australia, where I live now. And on the way, we met this wonderful Rhodesian. At the time, I guess it's changed its name now, from South Africa.
Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, yes, I forgot it for a second. But his name was Basil Brown, and he was a Rhodesian Olympic athlete. And somehow he had learnt some of the kriyas which they use in Indian yoga, including Nauli and Lauliki, which basically you have control of your internal organs. You can, move the internal organs quite easily using what amounts to the same as Valsalva maneuvers and Mueller maneuvers of cardiorespiratory physiology of Western medicine. But it's, learning how to control abdominal muscles. And so this became the mainstay of my practice. And I didn't realize it had anything to do with yoga. I didn't know what the word yoga was. And then in my mid-teens, someone someone at high school, actually, we were studying about the human physiology and the nervous system. And they said the nervous system comprises two parts: the conscious nervous system, in the somatic nervous system, which can be controlled by the conscious mind, and then the autonomic or automatic nervous system, which cannot be controlled by the conscious mind. And then in brackets it said, except by some Indian yogis. And I went, oh, who are these strange people who can control their unconscious? And not so long after that, I met up with the Tibetan Lama, who invited me to come study with him in Australia. And he talked about meditation. And meditation for him was sitting naked in the snow. And it was like, fuck, this is really difficult, but he taught me some cool stuff. And then he said, I need to study yoga. And I said, well, what's yoga? And then I said, I think I said, I remember they mentioned yoga in high school. And he said, yoga and meditation are the same thing. And it seemed a bit funny. Then I went to a yoga class, so like in 1977 or something. And it was just these funny people dressed in robes in twisted positions. And I'm going, what's the point of this? I don't get it. This is not what my Tibetan Lama was doing. So I left it. And then I went and studied at university and did a little bit of calisthenics, weight training, aerobics, gymnastics, a little bit like that. And in the beginning of the 1980s, someone invited me to a meditation class, and I thought, I don't think I can do meditation. That looks too difficult. And when I eventually did go, I just saw these people sitting in a room covering themselves with blankets. And I said, well, that's not meditation. That's just sitting in a cold room, getting cold and bored. And I'm not criticizing people who sit still and relax, but I thought that the essence of meditation seemed like it was something more challenging, that you could regulate blood flow to be naked in the snow. That seemed challenging. And as the years went on, I studied, modern yoga in Australia first, and then I went to India in the early 80s and studied with BKS Iyengar many times, and Pattabhi Jois and Desikachar. And I had an amazing teacher in Australia whose name was Bimdev, who he was the gold medalist in India in yoga in 1972, and he had the remarkable ability of being able to stop his heart and do incredible physiological acts, the type of yoga which is not seen today, the ability to, put a steel spear on his throat and bend the steel with his neck and using breath, or put a 2 meter long metal bar as thick as your thumb, which I could not bend over my thigh, and he'd put it on his eyeball and breathe into his eyeball and bend the steel. I still know him, he's in his 80s now, but he's an amazing guy. And he could do incredible things. And that really woke me up to the power of yoga. But then I was teaching all through the 80s, and in the early 90s, I realized I hadn't quite matched the abilities of the teachers I had, and I wasn't able to heal everyone. I had lots of students. In those days, yoga was unpopular. Not very many people knew about it. In fact, when I was first teaching in the 80s, people would have placards outside the hall where I was teaching because we were chanting Om and stuff like this. And they'd say, "Repent ye now, the way of the Lord is nigh, and this is devil worship that you're doing." And, it seemed like something very outcast. And so I was teaching and I had lots of students because I was the only teacher around. But then I realized that not everyone was being assisted. Not everyone was getting it. Even for myself, I was healing a lot of injuries, but not everything. I had a lot of injuries and accidents in throughout my life, in fact. But then I thought I'd go back to university to study physiotherapy. It was my third university degree. My previous ones had been in molecular biology, gene cloning, mathematics, biochemistry, human biology, stuff like this. And then so I finished my physiotherapy degree, and after that time in the mid-90s, I met up with a couple of Chinese teachers, one of whom, Grandmaster William Chung, was the senior student while Bruce Lee was the junior student of Yip Man. And another one is Master Yang Zhenhua, who is still my good friend, and he lives not far away from me. But his grandfather is the last of the lineage of the bodyguards of the Emperor of China, and we've had a wonderful liaison the last 20 years. And early in the 80s, my first main physical teachers were Japanese teachers. Along the line, I learned other sorts of martial arts. Master Yang mainly taught me martial arts, and so did William Chung. But I'm a terrible martial artist. The principle I understand, but I'm too much of a pacifist to take it seriously. But along the way, I learned all sorts of other movements, including I'm very passionate about dance. I'm a very bad dancer, but I love the idea of trance dance and fluid movement and just moving for hours and hours at a time. So that goes back about 25 years ago, and since then I've had a family. I've got a couple of kids, and I live in the northern part of New South Wales in Australia. And the last 10 years, I mainly travel around the world. I've just come back from 2 months of teaching. Before that, I was away 6 months. And, ideally, I teach mainly teachers, but I'll teach anyone. And, it's lots of fun. I have lots of good times.
So, yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. As you said, yoga is one of those terms now that's in the common vernacular of people. People they assume they know what it is. It's you go to a studio and you do some movements, you work up a sweat, you feel good, and then you go home. I was kind of mentioning to you before when I started that even in my lifetime, I've seen yoga change a lot. When I first started, it was right when I moved to New York City. And I think the story, now that I'm thinking about it, I think I was bartending, and I remember I really liked one of the cocktail waitresses, and she was doing yoga, and she invited me to the studio. So I went there, and it was a studio by, I think, Swami Satchidananda, called Integral Yoga. And they had this really nice program because at that time I didn't have a lot of money. I was doing a bunch of things, and they had what they called a karma yoga program where you could cook and volunteer in the kitchen, and in exchange you could get yoga classes. And at that time, I was very young and fit, and I remember going to the yoga class, and there was very few studios in the city at that time. And it was right across the street also from, I think, an AIDS center. And so I think a lot of the people there, but also just the kind of energy around it at the time, as you said, it was like very slow. It was just a few movements, maybe a few guided meditations, some chanting, And I remember as a young man, like it didn't really appeal to me so much because I wanted something that was more energized. And slowly over the years, I really began to see a change, to take on more of kind of an exercise routine. I mean, the just so many things really changed about it. But I always thought one of the interesting things is that very often, even in this yoga teacher training that I was telling you, because she's a dear friend, I won't say her name, but she asked this question of are enlightened people more flexible, and I just remember thinking like how far away from the essence the teachings have come. But this is going to be a big question, so maybe just answer it to whatever degree you feel. But what is yoga? Because again, it's something that everyone I think thinks that they know what it is, but I think very few people actually tend to go back to sources of things and look at things in more holistic contexts and look at things in the cultures they come from or the worldviews that things come from, and how do you take that and understand it and actually also translate it into a worldview of people like ourselves who are practicing something. And it's such a big topic. It's really getting to the essence of who we are, the essence to life. So to people who are obviously familiar with yoga, but maybe on a more superficial level, and even to you because you have so much experience, maybe even people who are maybe more deep into yoga, like what is that to you, to whatever degree you feel you can answer.
Yes, yeah. The definition that I liked for a long time was that you don't have to do anything to get yoga. All you've got to do is realize that our individual consciousness is one with some sort of universal consciousness, which is almost saying the same as what modern physics says, that everything's a manifestation of consciousness. I sort of like that, but on a more practical level, yoga obviously means union and connection. So for me, on a personal level, yoga is about establishing loving connection inside my body, and I call it sharing good energy and loving information inside myself. And I use that as a model for how I make loving connections in the world. And that is a little bit more whole for me than talking about stretch or strengthening or flexibility or anything else, or even spirituality. I think that if consciousness is the ultimate unifying force in the universe, then it has to be some sort of loving consciousness, because it's only love that seems to create things, when we look about how women create life. So I think that the most important type of consciousness is loving consciousness. And so I think the purpose of yoga is to create loving connections inside your own body and use that as a model for how you act in the world. And I try and do that in my life. Obviously, there's lots more to it than that, but that's probably the simplest way I could say it.
When people refer to yoga, often what they're thinking is some specific time where you roll out your mat and you're doing a physical practice. And there's many different ways that yoga can be categorized. That's often referred to as something like asana yoga or hatha yoga, maybe even raja yoga. But also within that framework of that term yoga, you have so many types. Like even I mentioned karma yoga or jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, or bhakti yoga, devotion. Um, how do you think that this body of knowledge of what we call yoga, like how did that form? Because it seems like it can take on so many varieties. Like how do you think all of that was categorized? Do you think it was like simply what you said? It's a path to this merger or union of something greater, and so any or everything that was somehow abled someone to do that, they labeled in that umbrella term yoga.
The physical practice of yoga that most people do today, I mean, they have many words that people use in the modern world, but effectively, all the postural yoga in the world is really forms of hatha yoga. And hatha yoga is the right side of the tantric yoga path. And the world of tantra, as far as I understand, embraces everything in the universe, in the world. There is no wrong, there is no right. Everything is right and wrong in the specific times. But some things in life are more dangerous. And the tantrics would say that there are certain things, usually 5 they described, which include sexual activities, certain types of drugs, meat, fish, and parched grains were the things they talked about, but they effectively include psychedelic drugs and sexual activities of all sorts. They said these things are not safe for everyone to do without severe repercussions. So let's create a safe form of Tantra, which most people can do, and they called it Hatha Yoga. And Hatha Yoga, it means, for example, you don't just eat any meat, but you talk about swallowing your tongue. You don't eat fish, but you talk about the prana as being the energy like the fish which travel through the nadis or the rivers inside your body. You don't take drugs, but you drink from the soma or the nectar that comes out of your pineal gland and the third eye, talking about DMT and things like this. And then also the sexual intercourse they talk about is the union between the Shiva and the Shakti, which on a molecular or medical level, the Shiva is more like your thinking brain in your head, and the Shakti is more like your gut brain at the core. And so the resonance between your brain in the head and the gut brain, the enteric nervous system at your core, that would be the sexual unification inside the body. And those things, to me, reflect Hatha Yoga. And to achieve these things, postures, breathing, movement can help you, but mental control is probably the most important thing. And then all the different pathways you were talking about. There's only one yoga, but there's just different approaches to climb the same mountain. So as you climb a mountain, you can climb it from the east face to the west face, and depending on how you climb a mountain, you have different things you might require. Like on the east face, it might be sunnier, drier. The west face might be hotter, more rainy, colder and more rainy. So you need different equipment to climb a mountain from different paths. Hence you have different paths of yoga with different techniques. But effectively there's only one yoga. And yoga that's limited to your mat, to me, is not really yoga. To make sense of it, you can spend 2 hours a day doing yoga, but the other 22 hours a day, unless they're addressed, then you're missing the point, I think. That's where the karma yoga and the bhakti yoga and the yan yoga comes in as well.
Why do you think in most of the societies we come from, that particular form of yoga has become so popular? Do you think it's just something that we in more Western culture need? Like we because of maybe a lack of physical activity, we need that. It's something that can be maybe more controlled and isolated and worked on. But like even when you go to India, like maybe up until recently, like very few people per se like did asana, but I mean you see yoga everywhere. I mean the bhakti yoga, I mean it's a culture full of devotion, full of knowledge, and these are very popular forms of yoga, but those never seem to have taken off, at least in the same way under that name yoga, as as you said, this hatha yoga.
I think partly the reason why the Hatha Yoga got so popular, and especially since 1995 when Madonna and Sting started doing it, that's when I saw it became really popular. And I think the reason was before that time, in the 60s, there was the big push towards aerobics, and that became very popular, but and it sort of peaked, I think, mid 80s. And I used to do a lot of aerobics in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was really fun to move. Then along with that, in the mid 80s, I traveled a lot to India in those times, and the beginning of the trance and festival culture around the world probably started there, especially with electronic trance. And that became very popular. And then the fusion between doing movement with music became even more powerful, and the rise of vinyasa yoga happened after about 1995, which was this fusion between the two main popular styles of yoga in the 80s were Ashtanga yoga and Iyengar yoga, which were often thought of as being Ashtanga very, very fluid and not much thinking, and Iyengar was very dogmatic and very linear and alignment orientated and very technical. But people wanted something which would merge the two, and so they merged it and created a form that they popularly call vinyasa flow or something like this. But effectively, it's not practical to merge two things which have such fullness in them. And what happened is the whole thing got watered down, and it created just the aerobics of the 21st century, where people are just stretching and tensing and there's no idea really what they're doing. They overbreathe. Mostly I see modern yoga to be overstretching, overtensing, overbreathing, overthinking when really they should not be thinking, or not thinking at all when maybe they should be looking after their hips or their knees or their neck, which are often injured in modern yoga. It's for many people it's dangerous exercise, many other people it's ineffective movement, and it's just you can't learn something and teach it, which takes a lifetime to master, and then expect to teach someone in a month to go teach it to other people. And that's what happened to modern yoga. It got destroyed, I think, by these large multinational companies, which decided that they can certify someone to be a yoga teacher in 1 month. So most of the yoga in the world today is taught by people who've learnt of someone, who learnt of someone, who learnt a little bit of a master, but basically they certified themselves by learning over a month. You'd never trust a pilot who'd had a month's training, or a doctor who had a month's training, or a psychologist. I believe to be a good yoga teacher, you have to be having the knowledge of a physiotherapist, a doctor, a psychologist, a master practitioner of your own body, as well as being a master educator. That would be 25 years of university probably, and people would say that's ridiculous. But you, as a person who's done martial arts, you probably know that people who do, say, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will regularly say that an adult learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will probably not get a black belt until about 25 years. So then you can, someone says, I've got a black belt in Jiu-Jitsu, you go, respect. Someone says, I've got a yoga teacher certificate, you go, So that's what happened to yoga. I think it got lost. It really got lost. It's such a shame. But I love it, and I'm happy to teach people. But the way it's being presented in the world today seems very lame in comparison to what my great teachers did and what I'm still learning.
You mentioned some of these amazing teachers you study with, Pattabhi Jois, Desikachar, Iyengar. From my understanding, they all had one teacher, and I believe it was Krishnamacharya. And a lot of people also say that had a certain influence, that, even the yoga of Krishnamacharya and then those three disciples who went out, and Pattabhi Jois starting Ashtanga and Iyengar yoga, and that, a lot of the yoga that came to the West was very much, if you trace it back, still even influenced by one person. How big of an effect do you think he had on the influence of yoga in the West?
I think it was a big influence. It was a big influence, but not the only one. Bishnu Ghosh, and I think his relation with Bikram yoga had an influence as well. Also, a lot of modern yoga, including that to do with Krishnamacharya's lineage, came from martial arts. There was a book written by Mark Singleton, I think, about 10 years ago, called The Body of Yoga or something. And he was sort of saying something like, I think he's revised it, I'm sure he's a really great scholar, but at one point people read his book and assumed that he was saying that modern yoga, which came from Krishnamacharya, was really coming from Western calisthenics, from Sweden and other places in Europe, and basically Krishnamacharya got a lot of it from the military who came to India in the early 1920s. And I always refuted that, because what I saw was that when I was learning various types of martial arts in India, including, I dabbled a bit in Kalaripayat, but also quite a fair bit in Malakam, Malakam means the wrestler's pole. And effectively it looks like pole dancing, but, where people would, guys would do backward somersault, jump onto a pole, which is 3 meters from the ground up, made of wood, and they'd catch that pole with one leg and then wind around it, and like pole dancers do today, but much more extreme, balance on top of a pole, do a one-handed handstand, and then fly down, sit on their pelvic floor on top of a pole and put their legs behind their head. And it was amazing stuff, but they would do it with the pole as a form of having something which was static that they could use and learn how to wrestle other people with. So it was a martial art. So what I see is that a lot of modern yoga is coming not from the traditional yoga practices that we often think of, but it came from martial arts. Hence, you see a lot of yoga postures with names like Warrior One and Warrior Two and this sort of thing. Warrior Two is this one where you're pulling a bow and arrow, and Warrior One is where you're about to chop someone on top of the head. So a lot of modern yoga postures probably came as martial arts postures. That's what I think. And so the influence came via Krishnamacharya, but there's lots of other teachers. And I had a couple of other lineages. One I mentioned, Professor Bimdev, who came from Swami Devamurti, who I met in Delhi in the mid-90s. He lived to 108, and there were quite a few other ones who got famous. Shivananda, of course, was a big one. But Krishnamacharya, I think, had the biggest influence probably in what is now presented as yoga in the modern world, probably.
How much, it was interesting, I was going to ask you, I think that book was called Yoga Body, but maybe it was Body of Yoga, I can't remember.
It could be Yoga Body. You're probably right, I think. Yeah.
How much, you say that a lot of yoga you think came from martial arts. How much truth do you think is in that book? I mean, because I think one of the interesting things we're very good at, I hate to keep using the word West, but for lack of better terms, but we are very good at kind of compartmentalizing things, reducing things, specializing in things. But I think sometimes we lose a wider viewpoint of things, and we tend to look at things very black and white, like yoga is from India, or even I've recently spent the last decade or so in the Amazon, and I think often people from the outside will look at these traditions as somehow being pure, like untouched, but they've been very touched. They've been very touched by Christian influence. They've been very touched by African influences, by other indigenous groups within the Amazon. How much do you think that is true? Because obviously the British did occupy India for a long time. That there certainly was calisthenics that you can find, and I think it was like Denmark and parts of Scandinavia. Do you think there is some truth that a lot of yoga could have been influenced by that, or do you think there's just some dance and it's ultimately hard to say? But how much credence would you give that?
I think that the physical practices which are in the world of modern yoga today, they have come from all over the world. I believe that every traditional culture had their own equivalent of both physical yoga and philosophical yoga. I live in Australia, and the indigenous cultures here have their own yoga. And I've spent time in South Africa and met people there doing what they say are traditional practices, which look to me like yoga. And then in Europe, I think in Celtic times there were yogas, and I had my Tibetan teacher and my Chinese teachers and the Japanese teachers, and effectively all of them used the same posture, movements, and breath control exercises. So I don't think the physical part of yoga is unique to India. It's just the only thing unique to India probably is the word yoga. But I think there are yogas all around the world. So the whole thing has been merged, and it was very astute what you said about what you saw in South America. Everything's been influenced by everything else. So as to what history really was, no one really knows, I don't think, I really believe that history was written by the victors, that expression, So we have no idea what history was. The only history I'm really sure of is the one that I saw myself from my perspective, so but definitely what you say is no less possible of being true than anything else. Mark Singleton's perspective in his book could have also been true.
I think that idea of martial arts is really fascinating. I mean, as you say, I think we all, maybe not all of us, but many people have that inkling towards peace. I mean, I think it's a natural human state that we long for, and yet at the same time, there's these beautiful ideas. Like you mentioned Bruce Lee. He has a famous quote, although I think he got it from someone before him, kind of going back to this idea of what we were talking about, the interconnectedness of all things. But he says, better to be a warrior in a time of gardening than a gardener in time of war. And, for me, that always had resonance. And there's another quote which is really beautiful. And I think it's in the Bible where it says, the meek shall inherit the earth. And I always thought that was kind of a strange quote, but from what I learned, and who knows what's true, but I learned that it was actually a bit of a mistranslation, that it was referring to the sword bearers, and to the sword bearers who choose to sheathe their sword, to those the earth shall be given. And to me, that has a lot more resonance, because it's knowing something and then choosing to not use it. And it's a very martial arts principle, like this idea that the highest form of a martial art is to never have to use the martial art, to win the victory without fighting. But I think so few people would equate martial arts and yoga, because on the surface they seem like two very different art forms. And yet at the same time, you mentioned dancing, and I think dancing is also incredibly related to martial arts. I mean, it's the flow between two people. The objective is different, but the actual practice is exactly the same. And martial arts, like whether we like it or we don't, I mean, it is at the very nature of the human being, because it also goes to this idea of separation, and ultimately any form of separation, there's some aspect of war in that. There's me and someone else, and there's a division, there's a line that's drawn. And so these practices of yoga moving towards this idea of expansion or union. But martial arts, like you were saying, it's something that's been practiced in every culture around the world, if nothing else, because humans at some point would have to use it. And there are so many principles in it, and even in a lot of the work I do of working with herbs and plants for healing. I mean, even often if you trace those back, like in Chinese medicine, or you're saying in Ayurveda, like often those went back to the monks and the monks who were also like the Shaolin monks or the Wudang monks, who were also martial artists. How do you see that dance? Like where does that line between martial arts and what we would call yoga or these other practices, like how do those flow together? Because I think, again, for so many people, they're two very kind of disparate practices.
It's all totally related. I love what you said. As I'm looking in the camera, I'm looking at my nose and I'm going, it's crooked. I remember why, because I used to do capoeira. And in, the capoeira is a little mathematical thing. You kick one time, they duck, you kick, they duck, they kick, you duck. And at one performance we were doing, I kicked 3 times, they kicked 3 times, they ducked 3 times, I ducked twice, and the foot went straight in my nose and broke my nose. There was blood everywhere. It was a wonderful interchange, and it was a fun interchange, but at that moment of impact, I got quite badly hurt. So dance and martial arts are intimately related, as you see in capoeira, but also love and play are also interacted. My main sparring partner for the last 18 years has been my son. And now he's 18 and a half. And ever since he was like able to even sit up, I was hitting him and playing with him. Now he's so fast, I can, I'm thinking I'm going as fast as possible. He'll grab my nipple in the middle of something. How do you even get through my fists, So it's been a really fun play we've had together. But along the lines of playing, we often get hurt a little bit. My mother rang us one time. Both of us were playing. Both of us had blood on our faces from being a little bit too radical. It's martial play is like two dogs fighting and playing as puppies, but then sometimes the puppies start having a fight. So obviously in the world there have been conflicts. It's important to be able to stand your ground, obviously, but most of the time for me, martial stuff has always been about having just fun with your body. But having said that, I was in India one time in 1990, and a fight erupted around me. And the girl next to me said, "Oh, look, that guy needs help." And there was a man on the floor, and there was 3 people on top of him. So I went up and said, "Come on, stop." And I pulled one man off, and another one pulled off. Then I realized the third man had a knife, and he's trying to push it into the throat of the man on the floor. And this Italian man on the floor was lying there like this with a blade 3 centimeters from his throat. So I just said, "What are you doing? Stop." And I grabbed his arm and pulled it away, with the knowledge that the knife could be turned on me, but I just pulled it away. And as I'm doing that, a 4th man comes running up with a machete, like half a meter long, and thrust it straight into my stomach. And this was the only fight I've ever really been in my life. And of course I got, I almost died. I was in hospital for 6 weeks, had to have my bowels removed and sewn back up again. So you never actually really want to fight, I mean, I think Jet Li had this lovely quote one time, and he said, what's the best form of offense? He said, making friends with someone. What's the best? Make friends. Don't make war, make peace. But it's really nice to be able to use your body for various things, and sometimes that might mean you have to defend yourself. Like I've never struck anyone in my life, but I know how. And if I needed to, if I had to protect my loved ones, then it happens automatically. Like it happened automatically that I didn't think twice to stop someone being killed. But it's a crazy thing. It's a crazy thing. But dance, martial arts, lovemaking, play between father and son, or my daughter also, she's an amazing fighter, and we've had lots of fun playing as well. She's 21, she's lethal, she's only tiny, but she does flying trapeze. She can fly through the air. She hangs on a flying trapeze. She's 35 kilos, and a man will swing from the other side of a long hall, tumble, does double somersault in the air, and she'll catch a 75-kilo man with her hands hanging from her legs with her 35-kilo body. It amazes me. So for me, the whole martial training, yoga training, dance training is just part of just having a healthy body and just enjoying your life.
Yeah.
And interacting with people.
One of the interesting things you said at the beginning, very simply, was this idea that yoga is meditation, or at least that was like a definition that you read. What do you think was being said when they were putting it in such a simple way?
If you ask an Indian person, what does the word yoga mean, they would say it means meditation. If you ask what meditation means in Sanskrit, they'll say it means yoga. But in the modern world, yoga, if you look on Instagram, will usually have someone doing the splits or balancing on their hands, or someone with the legs behind the head. And meditation usually has someone sitting in a cross-legged position with their fingers in some funny position. And so people associate them as being 2 different things in the modern world. But effectively, for me, meditation, the closest thing we'd see in the West today that makes sense to me would be the zone or flow state of the elite athlete, where you're doing something which is sustainable, engaging, mostly has a calming response in the body, is fairly effortless, but nevertheless invigorates or moves blood through the body effortlessly. So with the Tibetan monk that I worked with, he could sit naked in the snow, and he could do that for hours at a time, but he didn't get cold because blood was effortlessly flowing through his body. The elite athlete sometimes enters that zone state where they're not running at their maximum. They're running or doing whatever exercise they're doing at a level where they could do it for hours. And they enter this place they call the zone or the flow state, which you're obviously familiar with. And I think that is a better form of meditation for most people. For most people in the modern world, we sit too much on chairs, which is destroying people's hips. Even sitting cross-legged on the floor causes lots of problems. So I think you get a better result with moving meditation than static meditation. But whatever activity you choose to do to call meditation, be it static or dynamic, it has to be something which is sustainable. In other words, you need to be able to demonstrate you can do that activity for at least a few hours, But if you did it for a few hours every day, you'd be able to do it over a lifetime. It's not something that's going to destroy your hips after 20 or 30 years. And then it has to be engaging, meaning the engagement means you have to make it interesting enough for your mind to stay attentive, but not so many things going on that it becomes stressful. You have to make it calming enough to be at peace in your mind, but not so calming that it becomes boring. So it's that finding a place in your mental ability to be between the borders of boredom and stress, but just call it calming or stimulating or exciting. And then apart from sustainable, engaging, it has to have a calming response on the body. So you want to see that there's no signs of physiological stress. I want to see in a meditative state a lower heart rate, less breathing, less sweat, less tension, less stretch, less thinking. And it also has to be effortless. It should feel like something which does not cause physical, physiological, or mental difficulty. It should be easy. And the fifth one, the most important thing, is that blood flows effortlessly through your body. So you can be in a hot sauna, and everyone else is freaking out because it's 90 degrees on the top shelf of a Russian sauna or a German sauna, but for you it's just really nice because you're still cool. And then you can be in the snow, naked in the snow, and you're still warm. Thermoregulation is an important one, having effortless flow, because for me, yoga, if it's about connection, the way we connect within ourselves is by sharing what I call good energy and loving information throughout a pain-free functional body. And the good energy is healthy blood flow with a low heart rate, but that's what transmits energy through the body. And it also transmits information via neurotransmitters, etc., and hormones and immunotransmitters. And the loving information that we transfer through our body is that information which is in the state where we have a dominance of the parasympathetic nervous system. So by having good energy and circulating through your body, the body communicates with itself. And that communication happens mostly through the flow of blood through the blood vessels, but also through the lymphatic vessels, acellular flow of energy through the acupuncture meridian system, and also the flow through the nervous system as well. So this sharing good energy and loving information through a pain-free functional body, that's one of the most important things that I think meditation is. Whereas most people think it's usually a mental thing. I think if you're not connecting with your body, then you're missing the point of living. I think, for you were talking about in the Amazon, and you've probably explored all sorts of psychedelics and things like this, which I've also done. And I remember one point I was getting very good at leaving my body and, doing out-of-body experiences. And at one point I sat in lotus posture and I'm about to leave my body. And I had this message, this voice, and it sounded like my mother going, "Where are you going? The house is a mess. Stay here. Clean up your house." And I realized I had to get back in my body and recognize, look, at one point we'll all leave our bodies. While we're in our bodies, get into it, don't get out of it. And that was a real message to me that I have to, we've been given, like I said to you before we started this talk, that we've been blessed to be given this amazing avatar for our consciousness. So make the most of it, explore it, use it, learn how to use it, learn how to make the most out of it. Get into your body, don't get out of it, and connect the intelligence in your brain with every cell of your body. And one thing that BKS Iyengar said to myself and a small group of people, something which I really like because I never saw it written in a book. He said, yoga is when every cell of your body sings the song of the soul, which is not just nice alliteration. It really expressed to me this idea that meditation has to be a thing where 50 trillion cells connect. And the best way to connect is through loving connection. You don't connect with a person by inviting them to dinner and then shouting at them and stealing from them. You connect with a person by sharing your energy and your love, and that's how you connect, So I believe that's what we need to do to connect within ourselves. And when you make it happen inside yourselves, you've got a model for how you can be in the world. And then hopefully you act as a better person. And if everyone did it, I think the world would be a better place. That would be a nice thought,
It's really interesting that you speak about this idea of kind of the effortless flow of blood through the body, and It's interesting because I think usually we don't think so much about blood. It's just something that moves. But even in a lot of the traditional medicine systems I've studied, they speak a lot about this idea of purifying, cleansing, tonifying the blood, allowing it to flow again. You also hear this in, I think, a lot of traditional systems about this energy of movement, flow, allowing the meridians to be open. And interestingly, that you're also correlating that to that flow state. It's interesting. Why do you choose to focus on that idea of blood? I think it's very fascinating that of all the things to focus on, you chose that.
Blood is the one that people mostly understand in the West because I think when we talk about prana in India, also talking about chi in China or ki in Japan and terms all over the world, we're talking about the flow of energy and information inside your body. And blood is the one that people recognize to be the major way that things flow through the body. The nervous system also to a certain extent, but there's also lymphatic vessels and I said acellular flow of energy through acupuncture meridians. I think in Indian yoga they talk about the nadis, and the nadis are any channel which allows energy and information to flow through it. And so blood is just, blood vessels are the ones that people understand the most. And in the modern world, there's this big push toward this thing that people denote as cardio. Got to do some cardio, got to get your heart rate up, got to do some stuff. But actually cardio is an Australian slang which went all around the world because Australian physiotherapists are, reputed around the world. And so this Australian slang cardio, which is short for cardiovascular health. Cardio, of course, means heart. Vascular means blood vessel. And a healthy cardiovascular system is where the heart doesn't beat that much, but the blood vessels flow effortlessly. So when the heart starts to beat too much, you actually get problems. But people think they should get their heart rate up in the modern world. But in Asia, it's commonly said that, like in India, they say the yogi counts their life not by the number of years they live, but by the number of beats their heart makes. And so it's considered better to keep the heart rate low. And there's always this caveat that for between 1 to 10% of your practice time, it's okay to get your heart rate up. Everything is okay, but make the dominance of your practice time for 90 to ideally 99% of your time and your life, keep the heart rate low. Be able to get it up high if you need to, if you're about to run away from an imaginary saber-toothed tiger or a bus coming round the corner very quickly and you have to run. You need to be able to run fast, but it's for emergency use only. And that most of the time you don't want to put stress on your body. But when the body sees the heart racing, the body perceives it as some imaginary saber-toothed tiger, and you immediately enter a state of flight or fight. And the state of flight or fight is that place which then turns off your immune system, your digestive system, your reproductive system, meaning your possibility for long-term health is diminished. And also your cellular emotional body becomes that of fear, anger, aggression, lack of safety, lack of trust, when the sympathetic nervous system dominates. So I feel that's why it's important we have a dominance of the parasympathetic nervous system, which will encourage immunity, digestion, reproduction, long-term health, happiness, and longevity. At the same time, then, that dominance of the parasympathetic nervous system means that your cellular intelligence and your cellular consciousness is one of peace, love, safety, trust in yourself and your environment. And I think that's the one we need to permeate within ourselves for our own health, physical, physiological, and mental health, and also our social health, world health, our own personal, lifestyle and how it connects with other people.
One of the really interesting things you mentioned, and I think maybe it's become more well known. I'm sure you're familiar with Wim Hof, and he took certain techniques from Tibetan monks, as you were saying, primarily this idea of warming the body, being able to submit one's body to very extreme temperatures, predominantly cold. But there were tests done where he was able to not only himself affect his autonomic nervous system, but also teach people to affect their autonomic nervous system. And that was kind of a paradigm shift in the sense that it's supposed to be autonomic, like auto, meaning beyond our control. It's also very interesting that you mentioned again this similar idea that in these medical textbooks that was considered not under our control except for these Tibetan yogis. Is that something you can speak a bit more about? Because again, I think for so many people that's still quite a revolutionary idea that there are these bodily functions that seem beyond our control, but that actually we can to some degree have a say in those.
Totally fascinated by it. I actually think Wim Hof is an amazing person. You know, I've only spoken to him once. He rang me up once. We had a nice chat about 15 years ago. And the technique he uses, I've used in my own practices. I very rarely teach it to people because I believe they have to know a lot more than most people give the system credit for. I believe that, I mean, for those who are not familiar with it, it involves hyperventilation first. So you breathe more than normal, and then you hold the breath for an extended period of time, and then you enter some sort of meditative state. And then entering the cold water is a separate technique. It's a completely separate technique. They don't really affect each other, and it doesn't help you to do the breathing to go in the water. They're both two separate techniques with potency, with power. But he was achieving a certain amount of notoriety and fame because they did these experiments you were mentioning, where he taught the technique to about 25 people, and they were the experimental group, and then there was a control group which just did normal exercise for 2 weeks, and then they injected a pseudotoxin into everyone, and this would normally elicit some sort of immune response where people would get flu-like symptoms. And the study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is quite a prestigious American journal, scientific journal. And what it said was the people who were in the control group, who didn't do the Wim Hof technique, all got sick, but the people who did the Wim Hof technique did not get sick. And of course, this was taken by the press, sent around the world. It made him very famous. But it doesn't actually mean he actually did something for long-term health for these people. What potentially you could also interpret the results to be that at least some of those people, maybe not him, but for at least some of those people, all they may have done is hyperstimulate the flight or fight response in a way where they just stress them out. And most people are familiar with the idea that if you are planning a holiday in 3 weeks' time, but you've got lots of things you have to do before you go on holiday, and you have to work hard, and you're working hard, you just hope you don't get sick because you're hardly sleeping and really working hard, and you manage to get to the holiday, and the day you get on holiday, you get sick. Because the body will not get sick if you are stressed. Stress suppresses the immune system. And most people have this fallacious idea, which is backed up by the pharmaceutical industry, which says something like we are being constantly attacked and invaded by pathogens and foreign attacking bodies. Whereas mostly the body, deals with pathogens. The body's expression of sickness usually is the body cleaning itself out, like doing house cleaning. But you only clean your house when you've got time and the place to do it. So the body will only express what we call sickness at a time when you are predominantly relaxed. And so different types of sickness, some people will be stressed all their life and they'll suddenly get a major cancer or illness and they'll die. But that's when it's too late. But I think these results that Wim Hof got that went around the world, they may have been slightly misinterpreted. And I'm not saying that everyone responds that way. I did some experiment. I worked at various universities. I taught at Sydney University for a while, and then I had 10 years of teaching at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and there we were doing a lot of experiments. And one of them was they put me on a gas mask where they could measure how much air is coming in and out of my nose. And I did what was similar to a Wim Hof technique practice, which, as you said, comes from techniques which were taught in Tibet and India and all over the world, where I hyperventilated for 5 minutes and did 3 full seconds in, 3 full seconds out. So that's the best way you can really breathe more than normal. And so at the end of 5 minutes, they said, that I breathed as much as an Olympic cross-country skier would be breathing to do their activity, but all I'm doing is sitting on a chair, which means you way, more than normal hyperventilate. And at the end of that time, you're left with tetanus. My body was fully hypersensitive. I couldn't tell up from down. My eyes were closed, but I really was disorientated completely. And up until that point, this was about 15 years ago, I'd experimented a lot with breathing since I was a kid, but mostly it was breathing underwater. Holding my breath underwater. So my maximum breath retention was something like 4.5 minutes. And I'd never tried to hold my breath longer, but that was the figure that I thought. And when I did this hyperventilation on a gas mask, I held my breath and I got disorientated at first after the hyperventilation. Then after what seemed like, I don't know how long, I opened my eyes and my clock said I'd been holding my breath for 5.5 minutes. And I went, oh, I've never held my breath that long. And I thought, well, you have to be careful because if you hyperventilate, you won't realize when your oxygen runs out and you can suddenly faint. And I've done that once and I didn't enjoy it. So I thought, well, I'll push it a bit further, but be cautious. And I held my breath about 6.5 minutes. And then after 6.5 minutes, although I didn't feel I needed to breathe to prevent the possibility of fainting, I just let a bit of air out, tiny breath in, breath out. Then I fell into this meditative state, Jason, where I felt that, wow, I feel amazing. And for what seemed like about 30 seconds, I had 3 thoughts. The first was, wow, I feel incredible. Second was a more complex thought like, I've never felt this amazing in my life. I feel clear, grounded, calm, focused, connected to what I'm doing in the moment, here and now, light, energized, focused, clear, calm. And my third thought was, I've never felt this good in my life. Then I remembered that the scientist and the professor were standing over me and I'm just sitting on this chair with my eyes closed. So I thought I'd better talk to them because the experiment was over. And then I opened my eyes. The scientist said, I don't understand what just happened. And I said, what do you mean? What just happened? He said, you were going to hold the breath. And I said, I did. He said, no, but look. And he turned on the graphical output from the computer. And the computer saw I was going breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out for 5 minutes. Then breath in, hold the breath for 6.5 minutes. Then a little breath out, little breath in, little breath out, and then flat line. And the computer then said, for 9.5, nearly 10 minutes, I did not breathe. And for me, I thought that was 30 seconds, where I felt completely one with the universe, clear, focused, calm, connected to myself in the present moment. And that was incredible. That was the closest I've ever come to what in yoga they might call samadhi. Obviously, it was a temporary thing. I'm not enlightened. But in the text, they say that you can achieve this through breath control. And I believe that maybe Wim Hof can also do this. I understand from some of his students that he can also hold his breath about 6.5 minutes. So I've, got little doubt that he also experiences the same states. But when I've tried to repeat that experiment, then if I hold my breath for less than 5 minutes, there's no effect. In fact, it has almost a negative effect. But when I talk to most Wim Hof practitioners, very few of them hold their breath for more than a minute. There are quite a few, of course, who hold their breath for 3 or 4 minutes. But for me, that was never enough. You need to hold your breath for at least 5.5, 6 minutes more if possible, and then you're going to get an effect. Up until that point, I think the only effect you're going to get is this overstimulation of the nervous system, which potentially puts you into flight or fight, which then will reduce the efficacy of your immune system, digestive system, reproductive system, and potentially put your cellular intelligence into that more hypersensitive state, which includes the emotions of cellular fear, anger, aggression, lack of safety, lack of trust. So I respect Wim Hof. I really, amazing man, but I don't think that the effect that he gets is necessarily the one that other people will get. And I believe that the studies that were published in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science can be interpreted in several ways and not the way the media presented it. And I think if you read that paper, I read it some time ago, they also acknowledge that at the end of the paper. Scientists will say one thing, the media often publishes a little bit more of a whitewashed version of it,
Yeah, I remember I was doing that technique one summer, and I think I'd usually get around 4 minutes after an
Fantastic.
extended period of practice. And then one day I was sitting by a lake, and it was a very similar thing. I just got into some sort of flow state, and eventually I didn't even think it was that long. And I looked down at the watch, just I don't know why, but I came out of it, and it was like 6.5 minutes, and it was that similar feeling where I actually realized that I didn't need to breathe, but something else was drawing me out. And but it was a very beautiful experience that somehow had to do with a very particular, I think, state of where I was in nature. Because the few weeks after that, I was never able to replicate that. It kind of, it's very interesting because a lot of what you're talking about, and even when you mention this idea of yoga and all of these different degrees that it would take to truly be a teacher, like obviously one of the reasons people come to these practices, and specifically yoga, is for health. And health is another topic that it's so vast, it's so broad. There's so many different perspectives on it. Um, with all of your experience, and I think that's something where, as you said, like it's one thing for someone to take a yoga class for whatever it is, a month or 3 months, and then teach from a place of that. It is quite crazy. And I think something we've gotten away from in our culture is this idea of experience, and very much lived experience. And even I think in traditional cultures where there was this respect for elder people, that's who you went to, because they had a real lived knowledge of something, and it wasn't necessarily just something from a book or something that could be learned in a class. From your experience now of so many years of working in these fields, what do because even in the beginning you said, like, I don't even necessarily say that I teach yoga anymore, because and if I understand it correctly, that is kind of pigeoning yourself in a box, or anyone, and then we're kind of forced to see something from a certain worldview with everything that comes along with that. What do you think are values of health that yoga teaches, or these other practices like qigong, breathwork? What have you found to be kind of foundational things that these practices can begin to teach us? And I know this is such a huge question, but I think that's something with time and evolution, that usually when we start these practices, we have a very particular view of like what health is. And usually as there's a maturity, it begins to soften, to deepen. And what do you tend to express or to teach when people would come to you with these ideas?
I think that most people using posture, movement, breathing as their modalities are usually looking mostly for physical health. And when I say physical health, I talk mainly about things like developing strength and flexibility. And I think that's a very limited view. So I try and encourage people to also look at what I'll call physiological health, which means encouraging healthy blood flow, like I said, a dominance of your parasympathetic nervous system, or we could say a balanced nervous system, which obviously you need to have sympathetic tone as well. And so heart rate variability and establishing a good heart rate variability is important. And then also physiological health will include healthy hormone balance, immune system, digestive system, reproductive system. That's important, especially for longevity. And then also mental health. Mental health is obviously probably the most important health we can have. Someone who is healthy, physically strong, vital internal organs, but can't think clearly is not very functional. So mental health is very, very important. But then on top of that, there are two other types of health that I look for, and that is social health, the ability to relate to your family, your friends, the people that are in your life. Social health, interpersonal relations are really important. And then the other one is financial health or lifestyle health. Can you actually make a living in your life? Can you get on with the rest of the world, people who are not just your friends and family? Can you earn a living? Can you function? So that's the health. I look on 5 levels for health in that case, whereas most people with exercise only look at health on a physical level. I also look at health temporally as well, because many people practice in a way where they're looking for health in the future. We're going to exercise today. It's going to be hard, and probably you'll be in pain tomorrow morning. But in 2 or 3 weeks' time, you'll notice the benefits. And I go, no, you need at least to look at enjoying the practice while you're doing it, and that's what puts you in the zone. We only have the now. Past doesn't exist, future doesn't exist. So enjoying it while you're practicing is important. Enjoying it immediately after you practice is also important. But many people do these crazy practices, where they hit themselves in the head for an hour, and after hitting themselves for an hour, they stop and go, I feel amazing. Well, obviously, if you're in pain for an hour and you stop, you'll feel good. But so it's easy to feel good after you stop something if it was painful. So I look for enjoyable practices while you're doing them, immediately after them, also the next day, because many people are sore the next day after exercise, and they think that's a good thing because it means they've worked out. But usually it means that while they were practicing, they were stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, which causes the secretion of adrenaline and cortisol and endorphins, which are like the body's own cocaine and coffee and heroin. So obviously, if you're on heroin and painkillers, you're not going to feel the pain until they wear off the next day. But that usually means you've done some damage physically and physiologically, which may not be a good thing. So I look for also feeling good the next day after your practice. And then, of course, you do want benefits for strength and flexibility, etc., in the next few weeks or months or years. But then the other one that only occurred to me in the last 25 years is I also want long-term health. And I noticed that my friends, myself, many of the people I've seen in my life who do various types of modalities, including modern yoga, martial arts, gymnastics, dance, the typical sports that people do like football and netball and basketball, they don't have a good long-term result. Come 50, 60 years old, their bodies are a mess. And so about 25 years ago, when I was about 40, I realized that my body was not healing as well. I could do lots of cool things in my 20s, lots of backflips and lots of crazy gymnastic type things. But when I got to my late 30s and early 40s, I'm going, something's not right. I'm feeling age, and I didn't want this. And I realized that some of my older teachers, in particular my Chinese teachers, they were looking a lot better. And I started to really think about that I have to start changing my practice. So the last 25 years, I'm really looking towards now the future. How will I be in another 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time? One of my Chinese teacher's grandfather, who I said is the last of the lineage of the bodyguards of the Emperor of China, he says his grandfather was 127 years old in China, and he's still called upon by the Chinese government to ask for advice, and he's highly regarded. And there are these older people who do very, very well. And that's what I'm looking towards. But having said this, not all yoga practices were designed for health. I think we've always assumed that that if you do yoga, it's all for health. But actually, some practices may not have been designed for health. Some may have been preparation for death. Some may have been preparation for celibacy. So I've got good reason to believe, for example, that headstand, which is called, the king of modern yoga poses, and shoulder stand, they're not actually going to be good for your long-term health, probably. They're probably going to turn off your reproductive system. They bring supposedly blood to your head, but they're taking away the blood from your reproductive system. And this potentially mean that you get, and this is something I've learned from my Chinese teachers and Indian teachers as well, the more esoteric ones, that you are inviting for a woman early menopause and for a man early andropause. And andropause is like the female version of menopause. It wasn't a word that's as much used. So I don't do much headstand anymore, whereas in my 20s to my early 40s, I was doing an hour or two of inversions every day. Now I realized that like the yogis of India that you still see with one arm above their head for 12 years, that may be yoga, but it's not something that's going to help you function better in your old age. You'll be lucky to move the arm again once you bring the arm down after 12 years. Not all yoga was for health. But I am passionate about long-term health, happiness, and longevity. So that's what I'm teaching. I love this life and I want to be here as long as possible. And I'd love to connect with people and help people as much as possible. So that's what I'm interested in. It's physical, physiological, mental, social, financial, or lifestyle health. We want all of it. And we want it over our lifetime, not just short-term gains like many people do. And can I say one more thing also? Many people are practicing in a way where they're training till failure. And this common idea of, do a 9 repetition maximum or a 1 repetition maximum in weight training, where the last one is always going to be the hardest and you fail and you feel the stress, but that's going to make you stronger in 3 weeks' time. Or, even stretching till failure. Can't stretch any further. You get these micro tears. The body can't go failure. Subconsciously, your body thinks you're a failure, so it'll have to improve in the future. But in the here and now, your subconscious message is you're a failure. I don't like this. I believe train for success. Train in a way where you're practicing to, like I said, share good energy and loving information through a pain-free, functional body. Do an activity that's easy for you to do for hours. In physiotherapy, one of the axioms I live by is exercise is optional, but movement is essential. So if you can do just simple movements for hours at a time, I think this more replicates what healthy traditional people did in their lifestyle, where they didn't do exercise. They just lived a life. But we're so sedentary that if you can just get up and move a little bit, but enjoy the movement, I think that gives better long-term results, physically, physiologically, mentally, socially, etc., as opposed to suffering by doing a practice where you end up failing, stimulating all these endorphins, which are just painkillers, which means you're going to be in pain the next day when you realize what you've done, and then getting short-term gains in the future, and then long-term problems. I see so many joint problems in people who exercise hard. My sister is 63 years old. She looks amazing. Her secret, she did nothing for 63 years except the activities of daily life, sings a bit, plays guitar, doesn't overeat. She looks amazing. But almost everyone I know who did intense yoga in the 80s were messed up, multiple joint problems. And dancers, gymnasts, athletes, the same. So my level of health, my understanding of health, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something that's often unspoken in the yoga world, because I think a lot of people do go to it with this idea that I'm just constantly getting better and it's for my health. But it was one thing even I noticed is often a lot of people I knew or teachers, they were very often injured, and it seemed very, very counter to what was being sold. But there is, as you're saying, this mentality of always pushing harder, and it's a very interesting way of putting it, that you're always in a way in a zone of failure, because you're never enough in a way, so you always have to get more in order to achieve. And I'm also looking though, and I have a many times over slanted nose and messed up little fingers from jujitsu, so I think that just, I don't know if there's any way of getting around that in some martial arts, but I'm actually a big believer in not necessarily pushing super hard in yoga. Although I will say one interesting counter to that is when I was doing Muay Thai, I didn't have a very good butterfly stretch, and they saw it was affecting me. And one day the guy came up on my back. I was sitting down in butterfly, and he just jumped up with both both his feet on my knees, and I heard a pop, 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 and it was extremely painful. But basically a few days after that, until this day, I have an amazing butterfly stretch. So
That was very lucky, because I've seen people with the same adjustment and their hips were messed up forever. But you're lucky in that case, but that's an intense adjustment. Yeah.
yeah.
No, certainly. If your aim is flexibility, there are definitely pathways you can follow to get a very flexible body. But then often what I saw was it was compromising other aspects of your life, such as your physical or mental health, And so what I'm looking for is a balance between physical, physiological, and mental. But I'm not saying that if you want to learn a particular technique, there's not a better way. But I think people have to recognize that there are good ways of doing one particular thing, but usually when you do one thing for one aim, you'll always compromise something else, even if it's just the pain of the moment that you experience having that butterfly adjustment. So for many people, an adjustment like that will put them off doing any movement for the rest of their life. Many people will be put off even if they wake up the next morning and they're sore, they'll never do it again. In fact, from my understanding, the statistics that I've seen is only 9 out of 10 people, if they are in any way feeling uncomfortable during exercise or uncomfortable the next day, they won't continue. Only 1 in every 10 people has a regular exercise practice, because 9 out of 10 people don't believe in the axiom of no pain, no gain. Most people don't like it. But if it feels good, they'll do it. As long as it feels good while they're doing it and doesn't hurt after, and it's effortless. But that's not the modality most people work with, because most people who talk about exercise are those 1 in 10 who actually enjoy suffering. People like you and me, probably.
One of the interesting things, you mentioned a little some of these Chinese practices, like the last of this emperor's bodyguard, and
Yes.
like speaking very broadly, and of course there's all sorts of exceptions, but like even when we're speaking about yoga, like it tends to be this more active kind of maybe more yang style of going into things, and very broadly. I mean, certainly there's all sorts of martial arts in China, but often these practices, when people think of them like Qigong or Tai Chi or even these Taoist principles, which speak about this idea of longevity and slowing the heart rate down. There's this more of this general idea of slowing things down, of movement, of cultivating this energy, but through something that's gentle and flowing and more smooth. Because I know you work with some of these techniques like Qigong. What do you think is valuable and that can be learned and perhaps complementary or just as a path themselves? Because I think, again, broadly in the West, something like yoga has really taken off. People are, I'd say in general, they're familiar with maybe Tai Chi or maybe they've heard of Qigong, but it certainly doesn't have the same industry, let's say, as something like yoga. What do you think are the value of these practices?
I think these practices are very, very important. And I essentially, what I learned from Tibet, China, Japan, India is the same. The modern interpretation of Indian yoga looks like these stretching exercises, and the modern interpretation of Qigong looks like these very slow, gentle exercises. But when you actually go to India or China, you see that the Chinese people also do the extreme practices that look like modern yoga, exactly the same poses. And when you go to India, you see that they also have these very gentle, smooth flowing practices which look like Qigong. And then what I see is that in the modern world, they talk about yoga of Indian yoga being to cultivate the flow of prana, and Chinese Qigong to cultivate the flow of qi, which are effectively the same thing. But in the modern interpretation of Indian yoga, they are overstretching, overtensing, overbreathing a little bit too much, which actually blocks the prana, and people don't usually get it. But they get limited benefits on a physical level, but then long-term complications with joints, often many people. But it's exciting for people because it stimulates the nervous system. And then with the modern interpretation of Qigong, often what happens is the movements are so gentle and so easy that people will enjoy them if they don't like stress, but they don't necessarily cultivate much qi because they don't know the secrets of how to cultivate qi. But what they will get is gentle movement, which can really help people. Like I said, exercise is optional, but movement is essential, and it won't stress their joints. But for many people, the modern interpretation of Qigong is boring. Many young people go, this is too boring. I just want to move like this. It's too slow. But when you understand real Qigong, then you should be able to manifest energy in a very, very powerful way. And my teacher can, break rocks with his fingers, which are like this. But I saw Indian teachers do the same things. And so I think what happens is in the West, Indian yoga is blocking energy, and so the energy is not being cultivated. And in the Western interpretation of Qigong, they're not really harnessing the energy, because the most important thing about Indian yoga and most traditional movements, including Qigong, is that you connect the thinking brain in your head with this gut brain or enteric nervous system at the core of your body. And so the core of the body in Chinese movements, they call the Dantian, as you know, and they talk in Japan about the hara, and the center of the hara is the tanden. And there are words even in the indigenous cultures of Australia for the core of the body, which they call nadu kuru, where I live. But then the Indian word for the core is called the khanda. And the khanda is not a word that's usually spread in the modern world, but essentially the khanda is the origin of 72,000 nadis of the body. And it looks exactly like the seat of the enteric nervous system. And so the enteric nervous system has become big in the West in the last 30 years, and they recognize it to be the largest and most important part of the autonomic or automatic nervous system, basically the seat of your unconscious. And the idea of, connecting to your gut is really important, obviously. But also in Western physiotherapy, we talk about engaging the lower abdomen. Most people can't. Most people, when they engage the lower abdomen, also engage the upper abdomen. Most people, when they think of engaging the lower abdomen, inhibit their diaphragm. And what's happening in the West is that most people are totally not moving from their core. They're locking their core. And, you see it in every media of seeing fitness junkies, women especially. They're pulling their navel toward their spine, they're tightening their pelvic floor, and this basically locks your core. And when you lock your core, you disconnect from that feminine aspect that we all have, which is the enteric nervous system, the Shakti energy, which needs to connect with the Shiva and the brain. And when you look at reality, most of us think of reality as being this very logical thing. But even the cosmologist says that we can explain the universe. You just have to give us one intuitive miracle at the beginning, which they call the Big Bang, but basically where everything came out of nothing. All of maths is based on logic, but at the beginning of the maths, there's a bunch of assumptions. So reality really has to be based between intuition and logic. But most of us have cut off the intuitive aspect of our body, which is our gut brain. So the essence of all traditional movement, Indian yoga, Chinese Qigong, is connect with the core of your body, which in India is khanda, in China they call dantian, and to move from your core, to breathe from your core, to react from your core. That's the essence of yoga and Qigong and martial arts and pretty much every traditional movement system. But the West seems to have locked that. And the media is talking always about, tighten the pelvic floor, tighten the abdomen, take a deep breath into the chest, all of which just disassociates you from the core. And this is where I think that there's a big problem, Qigong in the West is probably as distorted as Indian yoga is in the West, but at least Qigong, if people do it, is a little bit safer on a musculoskeletal level, but many people will find it too boring the way they do it. But Qigong, when done slow, is accessible. Qigong, when done fast, you can move like lightning. I've seen, some of my teachers move so quickly I cannot see their hands move. But, they move very, very slowly first to learn, and then very fast when they master it. And my Malakam teachers, these yogis on a pole in India, would say that once you can do something quickly, learn to do it really slow. And once you can do something really slow, learn to do it quickly. And the movements that are easy to do slowly, they're the ones you really want to learn fast. And the movements that are really easy to do fast, learn them slow. And then you get flexibility on a much more deeper level.
You mentioned this teacher who's breaking rocks with two fingers, and earlier you mentioned these yogi teachers, bending steel with their eye or navel or throat or something. Where do you think that comes from? I mean, they speak about this idea of cities in yoga. Do you think it's something in a way that's because usually there's some supernatural connotation when people speak about that, or do you think it's just these practices that were really meant to develop a certain level of strength, that we've just forgotten about, that perhaps people don't want to dedicate themselves to that. And, what do you think is also potentially like the benefit of that?
Okay. The big push in the West, especially as people get older, is the need to do resistance training. This is very big, no? Resistance training is going to help improve bone mineral density and obviously tissue density and stuff like this. And so people want to do weights and resistance training for that way. But what can also cause very good tissue density and bone density increases inside us is also blood flow. So when you get blood pressure increasing, blood pressure is often thought of as a bad thing, because if your blood pressure is too high, you could burst a blood vessel and this will give you a stroke or a heart attack. But actually, if your blood vessels are strong, then the blood pressure means you have just more energy. So when you have to wash your car and you turn on the garden hose and the water dribbles out with very low pressure, you can't do any work with it. But when the pressure of the garden hose is high, you can do work with it. So blood pressure inside your body means energy. But the problem is, if your blood vessel walls are weak, you'll have problems. But if you gradually increase blood pressure naturally and gently over a period of your life, then you end up getting very, very powerful, very strong blood vessel walls. And so your arteries especially become very thick in the muscles. And so the practices, which include like the ones I said, breaking rocks with your fingers, or being able to bend steel with your eyeball or your throat, this comes predominantly from being able to control blood flow through the body. And when we're talking about prana in India they talk about 5 main types of prana. And the first one is called prana, a typical Indian form. 5 types of prana, one is called prana. And that's the one in your chest, and it's to do with intrathoracic pressure. Then the prana, which is below the diaphragm in your lower trunk, that's called aparna, and it's basically intra-abdominal pressure. Then we have one called udana. And udana is the pressure going into your neck and your head. So most people, if they push their fingers in their throat, they feel pain. You can't tighten muscles there, but by putting your pressure into that point, internal pressure, air pressure, I can breathe into that point, and I don't bend steel, but I can certainly, take a lot of physical pressure there. And that's how I can do things like headstand and stuff like that. But the most important type of prana in the body is one called vyana. And vyana is essentially your blood pressure. And when you get blood pressure to any part of the body, that allows you to have more musculoskeletal strength, but also it's what imposes this resistance training on your tissues, and then gives you the ability to have tremendous strength. And the tissue density gradually builds up over many, many years. Many people in the modern world train their muscles too quickly. So when you train the way most people train, it gives short-term gains within a few weeks on your muscles. But to get the same strengthening effect with this resistance training on your ligaments and tendons, it wouldn't take 2 weeks, it might take 2 months. And to get the same training on your bones would take 2 years. Who knows how long it would take for your blood vessels. But most modern training is too rapid. And what we need is the sort of training that is done more traditionally, which is slower, gentler, longer periods of time, less intensity. That classical film from the 80s, which was remade several times, The Karate Kid, where he wanted to learn karate and he said, no, you do wax on, wax off for 24 hours. That's going to train you. Whereas the short-term bursts will only train your muscles. We need to train all the tissues inside our body, especially blood vessels. And then this allows, people who have mastered it to do things like bend steel with their throat, or break rocks with their fingers, or like my Indian teacher, bend metal bars with his eyeball by bringing his intraocular pressure to increase to a certain level. It's fascinating.
You've had some fascinating teachers. I think you started your practice at a very kind of serendipitous time where you still had access to some of these really foundational figures. Is there something you learned specifically from those people, beyond just the practice, but from the character of the people, of their way of being, their way of teaching, their cosmovision, their worldview, that like anything that comes to mind that you feel really like imparted or left an energetic imprint on you?
I think the most important thing I learned from all my teachers, who I really have to credit because nothing comes from me, it all came from them, that the most important thing is this essence of love and passion. You have to be passionate in what you're doing, and passion is an expression of love. And so that's the one unifying feature they all have. And my mother was, of course, my first teacher. She really imparted that into me, and the idea that maybe happiness is a choice, not something you wait for. And my motto is enjoy your life. It's a choice. Look after your body. It's the only one we've got, and then use that to help other people enjoy their lives. And so if everyone did that, the world would be a better place. But it has to start within yourself, and that everything is a choice, including happiness. And it's nice if we don't just make that a choice for ourselves, but we help other people find that choice. So one of my teachers, actually it was Desikachar, the son of Krishnamacharya. He asked me one time, so what's the definition of yoga? And I said, to make our individual consciousness recognize that it's one with the universal consciousness. And he said, yes, but no. And he asked everyone in the room. And in the end, he said, no one has the right answer. He says, the essence of yoga is the relationship between guru and shishya, meaning the relationship between teacher and student. And really, it's about relationships. So yoga is about relationships. How well, a father and a son, or a mother and daughter, or even anyone in your life can be your teacher. So I always thank all my students at the end of a class for how much they've taught me. So really, it's about the essence of relationships. And when you can relate with someone and you can learn and you do it in a loving way, that's the essence of yoga. And that's what pretty much all of my teachers have given me. It's about connection. It's about love. You can only connect with love.
It's interesting because even in a lot of the work I do and a lot of these indigenous Amazonian systems, people often come to them looking for these incredible enlightening experiences, and fundamentally at the foundation they always speak of these fundamental pillars of the house, and unless these are in alignment, then we're in a state of disease, we're not happy, we're not whole. And all of those pillars of the house are all relational aspects, because again it's this idea that life is relational, which I think is very, it's exactly what yoga is saying, this idea of the act of separation as relations, and the act of love is to unify that relational aspect. You mentioned something also very interesting in the beginning, and I really liked it. Like a true yoga teacher, you need all of these degrees because, I think like any path, it's like, it's these very Renaissance ideas or classical Greek ideas of even this idea of like a liberal arts education. To be a fully realized human being, you have to understand the complexity of the world. And the more you understand biology, you can understand chemistry. The more you understand chemistry, the more you understand mathematics. The more you understand mathematics, the more you understand rhetoric. The more you understand rhetoric, the more you understand the human body. It's all interconnected. And I think that's very, very powerful. One of the things that I think is really interesting that you mentioned, and I'd be curious what your thoughts of that are you said one of the degrees that's really powerful is psychology. And, usually when we refer to that, we refer to the human mind, and it can be said that all is mind. But even in that Greek sense, that idea of psyche, it's also this mind-body-spirit connection. And, for them, it was very clear, like there was a spiritual component to that, as well as a mental component, as well as a physical component. Well, why do you think that idea of psychology is important for someone who wants to embark upon being a yoga teacher?
The way we think affects everything. Our perception of reality is so important. And one of my mentors is Bruce Lipton. You're probably familiar with Bruce Lipton and the biology of belief. And, he's an amazing guy. I've had the privilege of being on stage with him a few times at various festivals. And my first postgraduate degree was in molecular biology and gene cloning and stuff like this. So I really resonate with what he teaches, the idea that we're not victims of our genes, but rather we will express the genes according to the environmental stimuluses that the environment produces. And he had this wonderful analogy in his book, this story he wrote, where he said that there's this young woman with a young baby, and a snake walks into the garden, and she sees the snake, picks up the baby, freaks out, my God, and secretes from her body all the hormones of the flight or fight response, which are then expressed from her genes. But then the snake wanders through a fence, and next door there is another woman, same age as her, who happens to also have a baby the same age, sees the snake, but she's a herpetologist, loves snakes, sees the snake, picks up the snake. Oh, it's wonderful, it's a green tree snake. And the snake wraps around the mother and the baby, and goo 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 goo, yummy yummy, it's a lovely snake. Same external stimulus, same environmental situation, but the interpretation was different. And so then she secretes the hormones of bliss and love and connection. So the most important thing in our life is not the environment, it's how we perceive the environment. So our perception of reality is going to affect the physical expression of our genes and our physiological health and our mental health. So being able to control your mind, that's essential for long-term health, happiness and longevity. It affects everything. It'll affect our social interactions and how the world is. And that's why, I didn't do a psychology degree, but I've done many psychology courses and I'm passionate about it. I didn't do a medical degree, but I'm trying to learn as much as I can. I feel like a beginner. I'm 65 and I feel like I'm just beginning. So much to learn.
You also mentioned, and only speak about it if you feel called, but that you had worked with a lot of what you referred to as psychedelics, and I think it's something that's like it's easier to talk about now. Even 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it wasn't. But there's, in the same way that yoga has had kind of a renaissance, a revolution, I think certain plants or medicines are as well. And it's a really common thing, I think, maybe much more than people realize, that I think a lot of people who could be considered visionaries or very creative people who have brought something from the unmanifested world into this manifested world, who've harnessed this creative energy, have often had very big experiences through some sort of psychedelic or plant medicine. Is that something that you would say was some significant part of your life? And like, what was that journey like for you?
It was very important, I think, for me. One never knows, of course, how one would have been without having the psychedelics, because, we've only got one body to experiment on. But I think I had my first psychedelic drugs, which included mushrooms and LSD, when I was a teenager. As you say, it's something which you couldn't really talk about, and I've not really talked about it online before in public. But as you say, now it's a little bit less taboo, and now they're doing the research studies again. But my Tibetan Lama then said to me, well, when he was in Tibet, they gave him psychedelic drugs, which would then allow him to access certain parts of his brain. They would open doorways in his brain, which once the doorway was open, then you could know how to find it by himself without the drugs. And so this was something I'd been experimenting with at the time. And marijuana is not often considered a psychedelic therapy, although in Australia it's actually become the first legal psychedelic therapy when done at the right doses. So it can induce some psychedelic states. And that was something that I experimented with from when I was about 13 or 14 years old. And then when I got to university, this was in 1978, 79, I went to the pharmacology department, and they had me as an experimental subject, where they had me actually taking different types of marijuana and doing the tests on it, which was very interesting. Then as the years went on, I experimented with other types of psychedelics, including ayahuasca a few times and DMT and stuff like this. And to me, many people will say they're all different, but in the end, they all take me to the same place, which is this feeling of being connected in the present moment and feeling one with the activity I'm doing. And you're probably familiar with the studies they did at Johns Hopkins University over the last 20 years, where they found that the brainwave studies of people on psychedelics were completely unique in that they turned off the default network, which is what accesses your time traveling center and your ego center. And they said that the brainwave studies of the people on LSD were unusual and never seen anywhere else except in the brainwave patterns of profound and proficient meditators, not the usual meditators, the Tibetan ones who could really control their unconscious. And so this is what I resonated with, that yes, this psychedelic place is the place we look for and occasionally get to by doing good and proficient meditative practices. And so I still occasionally take microdoses of mushrooms and things like that, but most of the time they're more for physical benefit. Sometimes I get good physical results and it helps my joints and stuff like that. But mentally, I don't get the same, wow, I'm connected to the universe thing, which happened to me when I was a teenager. But really, this idea of connection and the way we connect through love, that was what psychedelics gave me. The world is a connected place. We are all totally connected. And the most unifying connecting principle is love. That's what they all taught me.
Yeah, beautiful. One of the interesting things, like, even when I think when a lot of these traditions, again, kind of came, for lack of better terms, to the West, like a lot of this idea, and still to this day, of kind of Eastern mysticism, again, from a very generic terminology, there's often this idea of aestheticism, of really people who lived in a cave or did these very difficult practices were very much not of this world. I mean, of this world, but not of this world. And one of the interesting things you said, like even when under the influence of one of these psychedelic experiences you had, was this idea of love, which is this idea of connection, which is, being of this world as well. And even as you were kind of, however you described it, like going up at your mother kind of calling you to come back down, come back to your body. What do you think is this balance? Because I think still a lot of people have this idea that in order to master these practices, in order to be in these states that these practices seem to be telling us to move towards, we need to be not of this world. We literally need to be in some other world, a spirit realm or an enlightened state, like something that's not of the mundane world. And yet also at the same time, I'm reminded of people like Nisargadatta Maharaj, who wrote I Am That. And, he was very famously a householder. I mean, he worked in a tobacco shop selling cigarettes. And, so there's also this idea of the value of the householder. And even as yourself, like you say you have a family and children. And I think for a lot of people, those two paths are seemingly contradicted, and it's something that I see a lot of people struggle with, like even the idea of having a family, because, and it's kind of that idea that we were speaking about in yoga, like there's always something else to achieve, and unless I'm on this kind of this path that's moving upward, like I'm always trying to achieve the next thing, there's not necessarily time or these other things of my life could be holding me down or weighing me down. What do you think is that balance? Because so much, I think very wisely, of what you're speaking about is this idea of balance, of harmony, which is ultimately health, wholeness, a state of ease and not dis-ease. What do you think is that balance of going into these practices, like maybe needing to be in isolation, maybe needing to go to India for 10 years to master something, or going to China, or going to some specialized school wherever we're from, versus also this idea of really being in and of this world?
I think both have benefits, but for me, I've always felt that what use am I going to have to the world living in a cave? And I have done it. I did at one time a 30-day water fast, living in a crater, no talking for 1 month. And it was very profound. It changed my life in my early 20s. But to do it forever doesn't seem useful. There may be maybe people in the world who can actually help the world by living in a cave, but I'm not one of them, and I've never met anyone who has that potency. So I feel it's a little bit selfish in some ways for someone of my ability to live in a cave, maybe to get benefits for yourself, but not to be able to help the world. That to me seems to miss the point a little bit. But like I said, there are people probably who can help universal consciousness by living in a cave and learning these esoteric techniques. For me, I sort of feel it's useful, and it has been useful over my life, to spend periods of 10 days or up to a month where I do go to retreat and learn and spend a period of time and then come back into the world. And, each year I've always spent up to 10 days, by myself to actually get some sort of refueling and learning and stuff like that. Even this year, twice, I've had 1 month trainings with my students. And although it's not my personal retreat, I am usually in most of my daily teaching that I do around the world, I've got at least 4 or 5 hours where I'm not talking, but my students are following me in silence. And so it's not quite my personal practice, but if you do 4 hours a day for a month, you feel something, and that's almost like a retreat. And so it's very different. I've just got back 2 days ago, now back with my family, back in my house, the mundane things of everyday life. And it's very different to when I'm teaching on a retreat like this, So it's not a personal retreat, but something, and I'm doing a lot of this. And it gives something very, very special to you individually, but also to a group, if you can do it with a group. But I believe that to do it the whole time, I recognized early in my life that wasn't a path for me. I want to connect with people, and I want to, I'm not a super yogi who can make effect with people at a distance. I need to be with people,
And how do you teach now? How do you teach to someone who comes to you just wanting to learn a practice, yoga or qigong, and also how do you teach to teachers? Like, what do you think? What are the benefits, the good things that can be taught that eventually can make someone hold that space as a teacher?
Well, the first question first is, as soon as I meet a group or individual, I want to find out about them. Where are they coming from? What's their physical body like? What's their physiological body like? What's their mental body like? What's their history? What approach have they been taking with their life, and what do they want? And then once I've made this, I guess, a physical, physiological, psychological assessment, then I'll approach them however I can. If it's a group of people, then I have to make a group assessment and see what's best for the group. If it's a bunch of teachers, and mostly I work with teachers, then I see what styles they've come from, where they are physically themselves, and then I try and give what I think is something which is best for the group while I'm with them, but also then I try and explain how these are the things that are not right or wrong, but these are the things that I think will give the best results for most people, most of the time, physically, physiologically, mentally, socially, financially. And they're not right or wrong, but for this particular group, this is how we can best approach you guys. But if you want to go out into the world and teach, then who are you going to teach? Because if you teach what most people teach, you're only going to attract about 10% of the population, even less probably. But if you want to maybe, like in the modern world of yoga, for example, almost no one makes a living because everyone's a yoga teacher. So if you actually want to make some sort of impact by teaching whatever you want to call it, some sort of posture, movement, breathing, mental control for health, happiness and longevity, then I tell my students, my teacher students, try and connect with the 90 to 95% of people who don't do exercise, who don't like suffering in their practice. Connect with them, because there's a whole untapped clientele, of people who would really benefit from doing something, but they don't like doing something which feels bad. But most of the people in the world of exercise, movement, yoga, martial arts, they're people who work with the paradigms of no pain, no gain, survival of the fittest. If you're good, you're going to go to heaven. If you're bad, you're going to go to hell. There's no free lunch. But actually, I believe free energy is possible. There's free energy all around us. So to tap into that, to tap into the feeling of it's actually really good to do something that feels good. It's really good to make love to yourself. You know, in Australia, people say to me, you just love yourself, don't you? And I go, yes, isn't that all right to love ourselves? But to teach that, I think, is important, to let people know it's okay to do something that feels good as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. And that may be by doing something, you know, and you're not just triggering some sort of, you know, drug response in your body or something like that, you know. But so this is how I approach loosely in a group, but in the end it becomes very individual. But if I'm teaching a large group of people who want to go face the world, then I try and give the things that will give the best results and the least worst results for most people most of the time, physically, physiologically, mentally, socially, financially. It's a challenge, but it's lots of fun.
Well, I think that idea, you know, even just that idea that happiness is a choice is such a beautiful teaching, and it's also this idea of the power of the mind, the power of the heart, the power of free will, this gift that we've been given. I even remember, it's always very much stuck with me, one of my teachers in the Amazon, which is seemingly a very foreign, faraway culture, and it was at the end of this very long, intense workshop of working with a lot of strong plants and conflict resolution and stories and myths. And at the end, as I was walking away, he looked at me and essentially he boiled down his teachings to be happy. And, you know, there's a lot of directions it could have gone, and that was essentially the teaching. And, you know, I was also reminded my grandmother just passed recently. She was almost 99. And one of the things she said to me was that every day when she would wake up, she would look around the room and she would just find one thing that she could be happy about, and she'd focus on that and be grateful for it, and that's the energy she would start her day with. So I think that's, you know, it's a really beautiful teaching, and I think something we often overlook a lot in the seemingly complexity of our lives. This has been amazing, Simon. I feel like I could talk to you for another couple hours, but I think this is probably maybe a good place to begin to wrap up. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to go into or to address before we begin to hang up our gloves?
I'm really thankful that we could talk as long as we did. It's very rare that I go on podcasts where they want to talk more than 30 minutes or an hour maximum, but I'm really thrilled that you're keen to talk for a bit longer. And as you say, we could both talk for hours, but you know, there's lots we could go on about, but it's probably long enough for most people to listen to. And I'm happy to talk to you whenever you want to talk again. I hope that we can meet in person one day if you ever come to Australia, or I'm not sure where you are, but if I come in your area, I'd love to meet you in person. I think you've had an amazing life and you've done some incredible things. So what you've described sounds incredible, and I'm looking forward to looking more into your work now and seeing what you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Simon. That's my son who's now calling me. So yeah, I think it's I think it's time. But thank you so much. You have a beautiful presence, and I think a beautiful energy, very similar maybe a life's path. And I think it's beautiful how you're tying all these things together. And again, thank you so much for taking the time, for coming on. And I'd love to meet in person. I'm actually in the States right now. I've kind of been all over. I've been in Peru for the last decade, but we're also starting to think about maybe where we're going to settle down more. So could be the States, could be Portugal. We'll see. But Australia is a place that's been calling for a long time. We've been invited to work there a number of times. We have a lot of our students there, so it just always seems very far away. But I think it's a place that's definitely calling. So I'd love to meet up if you're there, and wherever I am, I'd love to meet you in person.
That'd be so lovely, Jason. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for everything. It's a pleasure. I really appreciate what you've got and a wonderful family. I'm sorry to hear about your grandmother, but I think she left a great legacy in you and your family, and your son sounds really nice. So well done, and thank you, and much, much appreciated, brother. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. All right, that's it, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Simon. I very much so enjoyed speaking with him. I think he's a great storyteller, has a lot of wisdom. I think really seeing these things from a much deeper level, which I think is a sign of wisdom and certainly his experience in life. So again, I hope you enjoyed that. If you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Merav Artsy, we have our 2026 calendar up now. You can find that on my website at nicotianarustica.org. So if you're interested in going deeper into plant work or experiencing plant work for the first time, it's a beautiful opportunity. And then finally, if you're able to support the podcast, that's always a big help. So Patreon is a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. I really like that website because it's based on this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, it's a beautiful way to give back. As always, thank you very much to the people supporting that way. It always really means a lot. And then finally, helping with the algorithm. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the videos. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So I think that's it. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.
Dung